the vaccines greatly reduce your risk of contracting COVID. We know that COVID greatly increases your risk of having a clotting mechanism and having a stroke. So through that mechanism, we can say getting a vaccine reduces your chances of having a stroke.
Welcome to the Strokecast. A Generation X stroke survivor explores rehab, recovery, the frontiers of neuroscience, and how to peel a banana with one hand.
Hello, I'm Bill Monroe, and welcome to episode 170 of the Strokecast. The truth about the COVID vaccine and stroke, plus how to do your research. This episode is brought to you by the fine folks at Modus Nova. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of a stroke-affected limb, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. I just had my bivalent COVID-19 booster. Since I'm over 50, a shocking thought in and of itself, this is actually my third booster and my fifth COVID-19 vaccine overall. At the same time, I also figured, why not? Let's go ahead and get my flu shot for the year, too. So why did I get the booster? Because I don't want to have another stroke. And if I do get COVID again, I want to ensure that it's as mild as possible. In fact, the data is clear on this point. One of the simplest things you can do to reduce your risk of stroke is to reduce your risk of getting a severe COVID-19 infection by getting vaccinated and staying boosted. Now that there have been more than 12 billion vaccines administered worldwide over the past couple of years to help fight COVID-19, more and more peer-reviewed research is coming out that tells us in more detail about the overall effectiveness and, more importantly, safety of the vaccine. This week, I'm joined once again by Dr. Remle Crowe, epidemiologist and data scientist, to talk about some of these studies and to tell us how to do our own research by reading and evaluating the studies as they do come out. So now, let's once again meet Dr. Remle Crowe. Remle, welcome back to the Strokecast here.
Thanks for having me back, Bill.
I wanted to talk to you again because we're seeing a ton of research all about COVID and stroke and vaccines and all this other stuff. And here we are, right now as we're recording this, it's October 10th, 2022. And as we've seen this stuff come out, I mean, based on the billions of vaccinations that we've seen so far, do the COVID-19 vaccines or boosters from Pfizer or Moderna cause stroke?
So first of all, I think a ton of studies seems like a gross underestimate. There have been way more than a ton of studies. I think this is an important question in that, nothing that I've seen so far directly links any of these mRNA vaccines that are the most commonly used in the United States to stroke or risk of stroke. And we can talk about, we're going to talk about a lot of different studies, but one of the important things to look at are these surveillance studies after vaccination. And that's a huge part of any new treatment. And I recently looked at one of the two big vaccines here with over 6 million participants. So thinking about sample size, and there was no signal of any of these major adverse events to include stroke. So I think that's a big one. And we can provide that link in the show notes.
Absolutely. So of course, related to that is, does COVID-19 increase the risk of stroke?
That answer is yes. So we have seen that COVID-19 induces some weird inflammatory and some clotting mechanisms in the body, and that those who have had COVID-19 infection are definitely at increased risk of stroke.
Right. Yeah. And that's what we've seen in some of the other studies too. And I think I had Dr. Jason Hinman on beginning of the year talking about some of the research about why that happens and looking at the interaction of the spike proteins and the epithelial level layers of the circulatory system. And some really interesting stuff there.
Right.
So based on those two things, does therefore getting the vaccine reduce your chances of having a stroke?
So I'm actually going to go with a maybe on this one.
Okay.
Here's what we do know about the vaccines. The vaccines greatly reduce your risk of contracting COVID. We know that COVID greatly increases your risk of having a clotting mechanism and having a stroke. So through that mechanism, we can say getting a vaccine reduces your chances of having a stroke. Now, will it reduce your chances related to having a stroke because you have high cholesterol or any of these other risk factors, AFib? No, the vaccine doesn't provide some magic there, right? So we have to understand the mechanism that it's working through.
So getting the vaccine doesn't mean you can start picking up the cigarette and heroin habit to prevent stroke and not have a stroke.
No, and it probably doesn't even mean I can eat tacos for every single meal either, as it turns out. I mean, if they have that vaccine, sign me up.
So what about the Pfizer vaccine? We don't hear about that one as much these days.
So it's interesting. I mean, there have been some smaller studies that have, it's gone back and forth a couple of times. And I think that's what's frustrating for us as consumers of the research, right? Is that you hear this study today, you hear that study tomorrow, and they're conflicting results, and everybody takes it to a really political place, and we're all fighting on social media. But when the data come down to it, these big surveillance studies don't show any of the increased risk of stroke associated with either of the big mRNA vaccines. So Pfizer got picked up somewhere by some news outlet when there was a study perhaps showing, oh, well, in this small population or in this subgroup, we found this result. But by and large, the big studies don't show that.
So what about Johnson & Johnson?
So there was some early research, and we'd have to actually dig into it, saying that the risk may be slightly increased. And the important thing to think about there, though, even if we see slightly increased, is slightly increased from what? So if your risk was almost zero to begin with, when we do statistics on very small or very rare events, even a 1-case change or a 2-case change can drastically shift these ratios that are getting reported. And so it's still important to weigh your own risk tolerance and think about, well, is this increase in risk worth the protection that I'm going to get? And I think that's what it really boils down to.
And we already know there is a much more substantial risk of, once you have COVID, of having the stroke.
That's the really big piece that is important to take into consideration is, okay, we know the risk of doing this, but what about the risk of not getting vaccinated? And that risk is much higher. There's actually a study in the British Medical Journal, which is a renowned journal in the UK, and they had about 29 million people in their study looking at the risk of stroke following AstraZeneca is one of the more common vaccines there, and versus the risk of having a stroke after actually having a COVID-19 infection. And the results were pretty stunning. So with the vaccine, there was a 10% increase in risk, which is a ratio of 1.1. But with COVID-19, an actual infection, the risk was 13.9. And in epidemiologist terms, that's just off the charts. So for me, it's very clear that getting the vaccine reduces my risk of that by way more than the risk of a small adverse event.
And that's what matters when we start parsing these numbers and diving into these details and seeing some more of this come out is, how we're going ahead and evaluating those risks in those studies.
Right.
So let's get into unpacking some of this stuff a little bit more then. There was a study that came out about vaccinations in South Korea that was published in JAMA this past July that showed some promising results. Can you talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, and I think it's important even maybe to back it up a little bit. What does a JAMA mean, right? So when we're evaluating the literature, and I mean, today with the more than tons of research that's coming out, it's very important to think about this with a critical eye. So JAMA is the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it is one of the top tier medical journals in the world. So to be published in JAMA means that this paper went through a really rigorous peer review process. And I can tell you how much I'm getting torn apart by peer review right now at a different journal. So that process is really tough to get through. And these reviewers are experts in statistics and in methodology and in selection bias and you name it. So for me, first thing to think that this paper made it all the way through the JAMA peer review process. So that gives me one level of assurance, but that doesn't mean that it's a great study. So then the next thing I do is let's take a look at what were they trying to accomplish? What was their objective? And in this particular study that you mentioned, they were looking at how often myocardial infarction or heart attack occurs along with stroke after an infection for people who were vaccinated or not vaccinated. So that's an interesting piece, that everybody was infected, but those who were vaccinated and those who were not vaccinated. And in Korea, it's really interesting that they're able to conduct this kind of research because they use the Korean COVID registry. And in the US, we don't have a mandatory registry where we have to report, and we don't have some magical number that they can all track us by. We'd like to think that our social does that, but in the medical system, it's not linked. Very hard if you move from system to link up your medical history. So, the fact that they did this in Korea is an important piece of the setting to think about, well, this was actually even feasible. And so they looked at adult patients only, which is another thing that, as you're thinking about who might this study apply to, or would we see similar results if we were to take it to our own setting, it's important to think, okay, well, children were excluded. And then they were looking at this outcome that was a composite of having either a heart attack or a stroke within 31 to 120 days of having a COVID-19 infection. And a couple of things that came out in their population. So when you look at results, you've got to think about, were the treatment and the control groups different in some way that might explain the results as well? And that's something that we call confounding. So what they found was actually interesting. The vaccinated patients were older and had more comorbidities. So they tended to have more health issues than the patients who were not vaccinated. And so on first pass, does that make sense? Well, yeah, if you're at higher risk for, illness, and if you're older, you're probably first in line to get the vaccines. So that checks out. But when we're talking about who's at highest risk for having stroke, well, older people and those with more comorbidities. So the deck was stacked against the vaccinated patients if we were starting out. And what they found was, first of all, severe COVID-19 was way less common in the vaccinated group. And then AMI, which is acute myocardial infarction, or that heart attack, and stroke were more common in those who were not vaccinated. And they present something called a hazard ratio, which I promise I won't get super statistical and nerdy on you, but it's a really important way of controlling for the time to the occurrence of something. And they found that the hazard ratio was 0.42, which, let me translate that, means 58% reduced risk of stroke or heart attack in the group that was vaccinated. And that's after both groups were infected. So it's a really interesting study, and it's one that we should really look at, because we couldn't do the same study here. Now, some things to take into account, did they get the same vaccine that we would here? What other things were different about those populations? So all of that is important to still weigh, but this is a really exciting study for us.
It is, and especially since the deck was stacked against the vaccine to begin with, and still seeing those results. I think that's also telling, because I think a lot of times when we talk about the vaccine itself in the general pop culture, there's an assessment that it has to be 100% perfect and 100% preventative at all times. Mm-hmm. But in reality, it's reducing your risk of catching it. And if you do get infected, it's reducing the impact of the infection, which is why my May experience was unpleasant, but not complete and utter misery with a trip to a hospital. And I didn't have to take a trip to a hospital in Honolulu.
That's even better. You definitely don't want to spend your time in Honolulu in a hospital.
Yeah, spending it confined to a hotel room wasn't great, but still better than spending the time on a ventilator.
Absolutely.
So I really like how you're walking us through this too, and getting into these details here. There was also a report out of Cedars-Sinai about the vaccine, stroke, and heart attack. Can you talk to us a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so I think this study also found some similar ideas around that the vaccine is likely protective against severe COVID-19, which we know, and then that people who are vaccinated are at lower risk of stroke and heart attack. I think those are the key takeaways, but Cedars-Sinai is here. And so, we look around as we're building a body of evidence, and then this is stacking up in favor. So there's a saying in research, if you've seen one study, you've seen one study. Well, here's another to add to our fold, right? And here's another to add to our fold. And interestingly, before we got together on this, I was like, oh, let me see the 600 studies that came out this week. And there is a level of study called a systematic review. And so that was one that I found as well. And there were, I think, 600 studies included in the systematic review looking for this relationship between vaccine and stroke risk. And the leaning is that vaccinated individuals are not at greater risk of stroke. And in fact, there is some protection to an extent through not getting infected with COVID-19.
Well, and that's what's so important. I think a lot of people, when we look at studies, we've encountered things like every other month there's a study that shows that coffee and wine are good for you, not necessarily together in the same study, but although maybe. And then a month later, there's one that says coffee and red wine are bad for you. And it keeps flip-flopping back and forth so people would think there's like, well, it's 50-50. We're not seeing that same kind of result when you're looking at these 600 studies around the vaccines, are we?
No, and I think those high-level generalizations are what really get to us. It's way more important that we feel confident in reading the literature ourselves and being able to weigh what was different about that study setting? Why did they likely see those results? Was there something else that could be confounding or confusing the effect? One of the studies that we learn about in epidemiology classes, it's a classic, is that coffee causes bladder cancer. No, well, I'm in bad shape, let me tell you. But when you look at that study and you get into the details, and sometimes that means reading more than just the scientific abstract, which is that 350-word elevator pitch. When you really get into the details of the study, you find out, oh, wait, those who were drinking coffee in the study were also like 10 times more likely to be smokers. We do know that smoking causes bladder cancer, so now we have a mechanism. I don't have to give up my daily Nespresso yet. But I think that being able to weigh each new piece as it comes into the conversation, and especially as it gets picked up by public media, because the public media is just going to take the headline out of it, right? That's what they want. They want us all to get all up in a hissy and fight with each other on social media. That makes for good ratings. Yeah. But being able to read that and say, well, the coffee drinkers were more likely to smoke. I bet that's what was really going on. Well, this study was really small and focused only on a certain age group. Or, the actual risk was so low that it was pretty much negligible from the start. And when you add a little bit of risk to negligible, you can make statistics do some crazy things. I don't think I'm going to buy that one yet.
It's kind of like about a month and a half, 2 months ago, there was a flurry of headlines out showing a correlation between daytime napping and increased stroke risk. And that was the headline everybody ran with until you actually read the article, or even didn't have to get deep into the stats, start reading the study. And it says that no, needing to nap during the day was more likely to be indicative of higher blood pressure, poor sleep quality overnight, and all these other things that are actual stroke risks.
Right. The question would have been, well, what's making them take the naps in the day? What's different about that population than the population who didn't have stroke? And so table 1 of a paper is a really good place to start. And that's kind of what we did with that South Korea study, is say, well, what was different in the vaccinated group and the unvaccinated group? Well, it turns out the vaccinated group actually had the cards stacked against them. But, in the napping study, I bet those who didn't do daytime naps were healthier at baseline and had different sets of risk factors than those who did need to nap. And, how long were the naps? Are we talking a power nap? Are we talking you're so excessively daytime sleepy because you might have sleep apnea or something else that's keeping you awake? So I think that mental process of critical thinking is so much more important than any single study. And that's what's really going to change how we approach things, is being able to say, I'm a pretty smart person. I have the confidence to read any of this science and make my own judgment on it.
Well, I think when we talk about reading some of the science in some of these reports, and these are definitely available once you start searching for them. Most of the initial articles about these things, they'll link to the published report. You can access a PDF. Abstracts can be a little tough to parse, but most people with a high school level of reading, I would say, can probably interpret most abstracts. And then you start getting into some of the descriptions, some of the conclusions. Okay. After about a page and a half of these studies, though, we start getting into statistical analysis and all sorts of stuff that, how does the typical person parse that?
Yeah, and that's a really important question. I think we all grew up with a little bit of math anxiety somewhere. And it's funny because, I'm a statistician now, but I would tell myself, I'm no good at math. Math's not for me. I just can't do it, and I failed my GRE horribly. I was in the 33rd percentile. Even my mom was like, wait, you teach statistics now? Like, yeah, because I told myself my whole life that I'm just bad at math and math scared me. And then I had a professor and she sat me down and was like, hey, like, stop saying that. Why do you think you're bad at math? Did you get a problem wrong at some point in your life? And I was like, yeah, probably more than one. And she's like, but did you understand why you got it wrong? Were you able to do it right the next time? And I'm like, yeah. She's like, then you're not bad at math. Like, you just got to let go of all the stress around it. But I think that sits with a lot of us, right? When we see logistic regression and multivariable and all, like, we just assume, oh, I'm too dumb for that. I wasn't good at math. I'm not good at statistics, so I can't possibly understand that. That's completely wrong. We all have the ability to read these studies. And when they're using big words and big statistics, I find out that's often when the data aren't very clear and when the data set isn't as strong as it should be. So that should make us more skeptical, if anything. It doesn't make us magically think that's a great study. Because the best studies you can describe in simple terms and percentages and rates. I really like how a lot of these studies are saying rate per 100,000, because that lets us compare not apples to apples, but Granny Smith apples to Granny Smith apples. And now I can see, I know that 6 is bigger than 5. So of course we can read this. And I think that's what we have to do first, is just let go of this stress around, they used a big statistical word. You can Google it if you're interested in what the big statistical word is. All of these methods have been around for a very long time. Just try to read the parts of the results that are in plain text. A lot of them are, and those interpretations are often in the words of the manuscript. Maybe the tables and figures look like really intimidating, but when you read the words in the results, it's often laid out in a nice story for you, especially if it's well written and in a high-level journal like JAMA.
And there's probably also going to then be some related commentary from somebody like the American Heart Association, which then,
right.
It's not the primary source. It becomes a secondary source, but it may be more accessible to other folks.
Or a podcast.
Or a podcast, absolutely. When we go ahead and work through some of these different studies. The other thing I wanted to touch on there, where you said repeatedly to yourself, I'm bad at math, I'm bad at math. That's the same thing we encounter in recovery. I'm not going to recover. I can't use my arm. I can't use my leg. That is and convincing yourself of that. That's neuroplasticity at work. You
It really is.
Yeah, I mean, you're rewiring your brain when you repeat something again and again and again. Your brain goes, well, I guess this is the path we want to do. Nerves that fire together, wire together.
Gotta be true.
The same thing that helps us start walking again is the same thing that can give us lifelong math anxiety.
So recovery anxiety, math anxiety, it all starts inside the head. And that is a really important place. I mean, it's so funny how just that one conversation, and I bet that professor doesn't remember having that conversation with me, but she really changed my whole trajectory.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that also, and getting into wider systemic problems in our country, the broader narrative that women aren't good at STEM or men and aren't good at language and that sort of stuff. We reinforce that. We rebuild those patterns. We teach people what they should be good at and not, and then they become good at or not.
Yeah, and there's tons of studies, experimental design studies, showing that that's true even in very young children. So, before a math test, if you tell a child, oh, you're really awesome at this, or have them do something and be successful and get praised for it, they perform way better on the math test than if you tell them, oh, well, math's pretty hard. Women have a harder time at math, so good luck on this test. That does sit with you. And, they perform differently and they were in the same class. So these really controlled experiments show that what's going on inside the head really matters. So I love that.
So, getting back to this, what are some of these other studies that you've seen lately that are particularly interesting or high quality?
Yeah. And again, it's so interesting how fast science is coming out right now. And then you have pre-publication, all these other sources of information, and it's overwhelming. Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, it's overwhelming for me, and I live in the research world. So I think, rather than thinking about, oh, this one perfect study came out or something like that, it might be worth for us just to chat about, what are the things we should do when we approach the literature? Or if I just want to get a quick high level look, what are some places I could start at?
Yeah, that's a great way to go.
So I have a couple of things that if I was going to go to this question right now and say, oh, what's the coolest stuff that came out last week? So first of all is, where am I going to look? That's an important piece of this. You could certainly go to Google Scholar, but that's the scholar.google.com. Or you can go to PubMed. And PubMed is an academic version of Google as well, but you get this number called PubMed Index when your paper is published in a recognized peer-reviewed journal. So we talked about, JAMA is a really big, renowned medical journal, but there are a bajillion journals out there, and some of them are predatory. So there's two models to publish. One is I, the researcher, give the journal my article free of charge, and they charge the reader. Another version is I give my article to a journal and they charge me, the researcher, so that you, the reader, can read it free or open access. Those open access journals can be a little bit dangerous because there's no risk to the publisher and they're charging researchers. And so that's not to say that all open access journals are bad. In fact, there's quite a few very good ones, and I sit on editorial board for one of them. But we should be careful with those and say, are they doing a rigorous peer review process? Are they PubMed indexed? And do they have an impact factor? We could talk about what impact factor means. But these things are really important because, again, there's a home for every article, whether or not it's a good article. And it's important for us to think about, well, where were these things published? So PubMed's a great place to start.
And I was going to say, and that's sort of analogous to what we may be familiar with the whole traditional publishing of books versus self-publishing of books. And
yes,
we've had a number of authors on the show who have self-published fantastic books and done a great job of that. But there is no gatekeeper on self-publishing in general. Yeah. And so you want to be aware, was there a gatekeeper ensuring a level of peer review and other things on this content?
Yeah. And part of that measure of gatekeeper can be the PubMed ID. So if it has a PubMed ID, it went through some level of rigor because the journal had to earn that. So it means the journal's been around for a little bit and that has that level of rigor in peer review. Impact factor is another one. So these range from 0 to a bajillion. And I don't know what JAMA's is right now, but I'm going to guess, let's just look it up real quick. JAMA impact factor. Oh, it's at 157.3. So that's a really high impact factor. Some of the emergency medicine journals that, I more commonly submit to are around a 3 or a 5. But this impact factor is a measure of how often something that is published in the journal ends up getting cited in other work. So it's a measure of, well, that research was good enough to get cited again in somebody else's paper. And that's an important piece.
So when they do that, is that all just automated, or is there a way to filter out citing an article that you are disputing?
So there are ways to kind of filter through that. There's companies that assign these impact factors. So they're supposed to audit and look for, signs of foul play. So self-citation is something that's generally frowned upon. If I cite Remley Crow here in all of my future papers, that's inflating my own author index. So that's generally frowned upon. But there are ways to look at different impact factors. So different companies will calculate them. But if you see, they're getting the same rating over and over, like JAMA always has an incredibly high impact factor. Since COVID, though, journal impact factors have skyrocketed because the rate of publication skyrocketed. And something that you said was really important earlier. Most of you can read the full text for free. During COVID, a lot of the journals gave waivers so they could make their articles open access, meaning that the reader does not need to pay for a subscription. And that was done primarily for any work related to COVID. So it was much easier and faster to publish during COVID. So a lot of these journals, their impact factor went up. So it's important to look at them relative to each other as well. Like, obviously, not every journal is going to be a JAMA or a New England Journal of Medicine, I would bet is even a little higher. But if you see an impact factor of 0.2, okay, maybe that's still okay. But, or you see a journal that has no impact factor, we read that with a little bit more skepticism. Again, not to say it can't be a great piece of literature, but the same healthy skepticism for self-publishing. That's a great analogy. Okay. And then, so once we get into PubMed and we search whatever it is we're interested in this case, we want to look at vaccination and stroke. Place to start is maybe sort by most recent. And then we can look, are there any systematic reviews? So there's a hierarchy of study designs, case series or case study being the lowest, which is just one person's story or a couple of people's stories. And then we move into some of these observational studies where the researchers didn't control the treatment and who got it. And so there wasn't any randomization, and that there might be something driving the differences we're seeing. But big observational studies, when they're well designed, can provide a lot of important evidence. Then we're really familiar with randomized control trials, especially during vaccines and things like that. And that's where the researcher controls the treatment. And in the best studies, the researchers and the participants are blind as to who got treatment and who got a placebo. And then we move up the chain to these systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which is a really great place to start if we're just trying to get a handle on what's the state of the science. And that's where they put all of the studies that have been done together and they rate the quality of the literature. So they did that hard part for us where they're like, this was a small study conducted in an unrealistic setting, so we're going to weight it down. This was a huge study with 26 million people, and it reflects the real world, so we're going to rate it up. But all of that has been summarized there for you. And I wouldn't say just stop there, but maybe find a couple of the highest rated studies and then go look at the full paper on those. And that'll start to help you build this body of evidence in your own mind and really get to what's out there and what questions are still unknown.
So these systemic studies then are looking at, obviously a much wider array of participants and treating participants. And so we're getting this increased scale. We're getting this look at these different, slightly different processes in this analysis. At the same time, the systemic studies then also sounds like, are they adding then a subjective factor or an editorialization on the part of the people conducting the systemic analysis?
So that's a really important thing to look at. But there's actually very rigorous methods for how these two types of analyses are carried out. So there's systematic review and then there's meta-analysis. Now, systematic review is a precursor to meta-analysis, but not all systematic reviews end in meta-analysis. So systematic review means going to the literature and systematically, so you have to identify what keywords you followed, and there's reporting guidelines on how these need to be published. And you say, we searched from this time frame in these sources. These were the inclusion criteria. So we didn't get to pick and choose which studies we put in. We had to include all of the studies that met these criteria. And then after that systematic review portion, based on the evidence and how different the studies were, so there's a measure called heterogeneity. And if we find out that all the studies were really different, like one was done in this country, one was done in that country, there were only 6 patients, they were really, really different. We only gave it to people with blue eyes in the study. Then we say, you know what, these are not good enough to pool together into one estimate. Like it makes no sense to put them together because they don't reflect one reality. And then you stop there at the systematic review. But if you say, all right, there's a lot of data here and the data were all pretty rigorous and the reasons that people got the treatment in each group are pretty similar, then you can pool the data and make one monster pile of data and look at the overall effect. And that's the meta-analysis portion. And you'll see these summary graphics are really cool because it'll show what we call a forest plot. And this is one of my favorite graphics. And then at the very end of that forest plot is a diamond, and the diamond is the overall effect. So if you have some studies found no difference, some studies found a big difference, it'll show you overall, are we at no difference or can we lean one way or another? And that's important for something that's rare. Unfortunately, with COVID, it hasn't been rare. So we've been able to study it on a big scale in individual studies. But you think of something rare like pediatric stroke, it would be really, really hard to study that at a single hospital or at a single center. So these meta-analyses help us pool all of those rare events and see which way the data are leading.
I think that's really interesting. So the systemic studies are basically sort of like a literature review and a collection of this is all what's out there and this is what their conclusions are generally saying. When you get to the meta-analysis, what you're doing is you're actually taking the numbers out of those systemic analysis studies. You're putting them into one table, overly simplified, of course, but one pool of data.
That's it.
And then extracting the results from those data, that data as well.
The overall result. And then you display the individual results and that overall estimate to say, if these had all come from one study, this is what we would have seen. But the big thing with that is read it with a critical eye and say, was it reasonable to combine the results of those studies? So, in the early days of COVID, there were a couple of Egyptian studies where there were some concern around that data was mistakenly reported and something was wrong in the data. So if we mix that in with other data, we probably wouldn't get a reasonable result. And that's something that the reader should also beware. And again, we're all capable of taking a look at this and saying, that just doesn't pass gut check for me. And let's dig into why.
So we've been seeing now more of these systemic studies coming out about COVID vaccines and stroke. Are we seeing any completed meta-analyses at this point?
There's a ton. So this was actually fascinating. I thought, I'll just go and see what's out there, right? So in the Journal of Neurological Science in August of 2022, I instantly found one. And I'm sure if I went back into PubMed in 5 minutes, I'd find 5 more of these. But it was looking at acute ischemic stroke and vaccine-induced immune thrombotic thrombocytopenia. Let's just call that vaccine-induced stroke post-COVID-19 vaccine. And this was just a systematic review. They did not pool all the data together so that the information was too varied for them to pull together reliably. But take a guess. Like, how many articles do you think they found that have been published on this? I mean, thinking back that COVID-19's only really been around since 2020, and they completed their search on April 14th, 2022. How many articles do you think were in there?
Well, I would say there's probably 200 or 300.
Yeah, you're right on. They found 447.
Wow.
So they screened, for irrelevant articles that didn't meet their study criteria. And they ended up actually out of those studies. So they had some pretty rigorous inclusion criteria. They only ended up including 29 studies with 43 patients. So now, my index goes way down in this particular analysis.
Sure.
But there's other ones where they kept these millions and millions and millions of patients, but it really depends on what question is being asked. And the part that I keep seeing in these systematic reviews is overwhelmingly, we see that getting COVID-19 is associated with much higher risk of having a clotting event, and that can lead to things like heart attack and stroke, as well as some inflammatory responses. And these inflammatory responses cause bad things like myocarditis. And so we know that risk associated with COVID-19. We know that vaccines in these meta-analyses, again, reduce the risk of contracting severe COVID-19 or dying. And so when we study these risk ratios, well, what's my risk of having a stroke with the vaccine? What's my risk of stroke with not having the vaccine? Overwhelmingly, we see the risk is reduced. But that pathway is, again, through not getting a severe infection, because we've given our body this, it's kind of a roadmap. It's an imperfect roadmap, but it's a roadmap to what virus this is and how we can better defend ourselves against it.
And you mentioned the inflammatory response and myocarditis there. I do want to also ask about a newer report that's come out and is being used to drive some political decisions regarding
that never happens. Yeah, what are you talking about?
Exactly. Regarding vaccine and alleged vaccine-induced myocarditis in men under 40. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I know you've only had a brief chance to look at that study.
Yeah. So this is, again, a study that came out in 2022 in JAMA. So level of suspicion is way down. Okay. And I walked through the abstract on this one and I'm like, well, what were they trying to do? Well, they wanted to look at myocarditis after one of the mRNA vaccines. So we're talking Pfizer or Moderna. And they were looking at the CDC reporting database where, it sends you the text message and it was you tell it if you had any events. It's the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, or the VAERS. So remember, that's a voluntary reporting thing. It's like the first thing that's in my brain. It's not like that Korea study where it's mandatory reporting and that we actually think they have a mechanism to enforce mandatory reporting.
An adverse reporting system, as I understand it, includes anything that goes wrong after a vaccine. I mean, if I get my shot at the pharmacist and then I slip off the curb in front of a bus, that's an adverse reporting event.
Yeah, no, and it would be. And so like that's where these large studies help us because there's some stuff that's due to random chance alone, right? Like there's a random chance that tomorrow I'm going to get hit by a bus. There's a random chance that tomorrow I'm going to have a cold. So we have to be able to tease out, well, what was that baseline random chance versus what's the chance in that vaccinated population to see if there's a risk. So this VA-ERS database is set to help us quantify, is there a difference from baseline? And that's why they used it. But we do have to remember it's voluntary. So like you'd be more likely to respond to that text message if you thought something bad happened to you because of the vaccine. So that's the first like little selection bias nugget to keep in our heads, right? And then we really get into the meat of the study. And remember, I said sample size definitely like grossly affects everything. So, well, how big of a sample did they have? Well, I read the results and I see among 192 million, and then I shut up and I'm like, okay, it's a pretty big study.
That's a pretty
Should
big
probably
sample.
calm down. Yeah, it's a big study. Okay. But then I'm like, all right, let's see. Oh, and I skipped ahead real quick and I was like, oh my gosh, there was an increased rate, 70.7 per million doses. Oh my goodness, in adolescent males. And so I got stressed out for a second. But then I went back and read a little more carefully and I found out overall there were 1,991 reports of myocarditis to the database out of 192 million people who received the vaccine. So I think I did the math on my calculator here right. I mean, it couldn't even show me the number. It said to the -5. So I think that is a 0.00, what did it call it? 0.0001% chance of this from the vaccine. And so again, when you have something that's that incredibly rare, like 1,000 out of 192 million, if you have something that's that incredibly rare, it's really easy to make statistical ratios dance. So those huge ratios still, when your risk of nothing is nothing, it's still nothing. So that is my takeaway from this personally. I'm like, the increase in risk is negligible. There was nothing to start with.
That's very good news.
That's not what the media took away from that, unfortunately.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. But we will
not how it
include
goes.
links to that, of course, so you can go ahead and read that yourself and check
Yeah.
that out. And also then walk through the analysis Emily's just done on that, so you can see that in that data. One other key stat I wanted to sort of tease out, if you have available. We've still seen a lot of people dying of COVID. We've seen a lot, and some of them have been vaccinated.
Right.
Of the people who are dying of COVID this year, do you know what percentage of them have been unvaccinated versus vaccinated?
So I think that's a hard one too, because when we report, there's all the skepticism around. Well, they're just writing it on the death certificate, and this is not going to convince anybody because they're not going to believe that like it wasn't altered data somehow. So this is again where I'd rather empower you all with the tools to go out and see what you can see. I will say one of the big surveillance sources that has been around for a long time is the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. So that's a CDC document, and it is peer reviewed.
Awesome name for a document.
It is. I've published in it before, but it was a hard process to get into it. I can tell you their peer reviewers were very rigorous, and it came back to me no less than 3 times and quick turnarounds on everything. So having that experience, I have a little bit of faith in, okay, let's just see what's out there. And again, we have to think through that comparison group, like who's more likely to get vaccinated. So we know that older people are usually first in line when there was a limited, resource around this. And then, they probably have different comorbidities. So they might have different health conditions in addition to age being a risk factor. And then we think, well, they might also have different behaviors. Like people who are going to go get that vaccine probably behave a little bit differently than people who wouldn't get the vaccine. So we put all of that in context. But then we look at the rates, and the death rates for those who were fully vaccinated with a booster versus those who were fully vaccinated with no booster and those who were unvaccinated. And we put that back into that, Granny Smith apple to Granny Smith apple per 100,000 population measure. And we go from the lowest rates were those who were vaccinated with the booster, 0.1 per 100,000. Then we go to those fully vaccinated with no booster, 0.6 out of 100,000. And then when we get to no vaccination, it's 7.8 per 100,000. And so those numbers should resonate. Like the point 1 to point 0.6 wasn't a really big jump, but that jump from having any vaccine to no vaccine was huge. And we think that those who don't get vaccines are in a younger, healthier age group and think that, oh, well, I don't need this. Like, my immune system will take care of business. When we have a novel virus like this, giving your vaccine any type of roadmap, even if imperfect, can go a long way. And, I'm one of the same people who I had all of my vaccines and my booster, and I still got COVID-19. It was extraordinarily mild. But, I had to sniffle, took the test and was like, yep, here we are. But yeah, I don't think, oh, well, that was garbage. Why did I even waste my time and my sore shoulder? And I felt like sick for a couple of days. No, I know how much worse that could have been. I gave my immune system a chance.
And I think generally as human nature, we don't generally tend to think about how much worse things could have been for us as compared to how they are.
It's easy to see what we see, but it's hard. That sliding door movie comes to mind. If you haven't seen that, it's about what could have happened and what didn't happen. And so it's really hard to see the other side of that.
We need to get some more views into those alternate timelines.
Yeah, we all need to go watch Sliding Door one more time.
Watch Sliding Doors. We'll include a link to the trailer.
There you go.
So, stepping away from COVID for a moment, we are now in the heart of fall, and we are going to be very quickly heading into November. So it's time, or really it's past time, to be thinking about our flu vaccines. Which are now available here in the U.S. at least. It's Southern Hemisphere. You're probably on the alternate. You're probably 6 months away from thinking about your next flu vaccine.
That's right.
So I know there's a lot of skepticism about the flu shot as well. So what are you seeing from the latest research about the flu shot and its effectiveness and safety?
And before COVID, this was the one we like to fight about.
I know.
Right? It doesn't work. I still got sick. Oh, no.
Exactly.
I think the same virology applies here, right? Like it's an imperfect roadmap for your immune system. Yes, it's not 100% right. The vaccine, the actual virus itself can morph. It's a pretty smart virus, it turns out. So we might not have guessed it right at the beginning of flu season. But that doesn't mean that it's useless or that it's a terrible idea. And I was one of these people too. I think I'm a pretty healthy individual. What do I need it for? But then I started working in EMS and I was taking care of really sick people. And I realized, what? It's not about me. And one poke in the arm, as much as I hate needles, I'm fine with putting needles in people. I do not like to have them put in me. But, that sacrifice was okay if I wasn't going to potentially spread the flu to the older lady I was taking care of who had breast cancer. And that was what was important for me when I think about it. So it's not just that it prevents me. I'm not going to die if I get the flu. It's pretty unlikely. But that's not what it's about. It's about me inadvertently picking it up and giving it to somebody else. And if I never contract it, I'm so much less likely to give it to somebody. So again, this is just an imperfect roadmap for your immune system to say, hey, this might come at you. And if it does, you should fight it. And I think that's the way that I approach flu vaccine. And I definitely get mine. And I think the first or second week of October is actually the prime time to get it because it'll give you that lasting protection up until February, which is really, that peak and that end of flu season. So now is a really good time to do that.
Well, great. And I think a lot of people who say it didn't work and they got sick anyway, they didn't really get flu. I think flu is a very different disease than what a lot of people think flu is.
Well, there's so many ways of looking at that too. So I've heard it too, right? I got the shot and then I got the flu. So let's break that down. I got the flu the next day. Let's start with that one, right? That's possible, one, because flu vaccines don't work instantly. So maybe you went to Target, got your vaccine, and picked up the flu while you were looking at something. So one, that is possible. Two, it could be your immune response. So a lot of us, this was more common with the mRNA vaccines. It meant your immune system was doing something. Like I know I got the fever and chills for a few hours, and then like magic at hour 8, I was fine again. But maybe what we felt was our body doing its job and like heating up the fight. So that's another thing. Or like you said, maybe it wasn't the flu. A lot of people think of the flu as a stomach bug. That's not typically influenza, that foodborne stomach bug thing. Influenza tends to be respiratory. So another thing that's out there and super scary is the paraflu. it's a lot like influenza, but it's not. And that means, our shot is not going to protect us against that one. It doesn't have the same pathway. It doesn't have the same pattern for our body to go after. And then there's a bunch of other viruses that are just running around it all the time, right? And you hear about in children, RSV is a big one. And it's really critical at this time of the year as well to be on the lookout for. So, I would say it's still possible you got the flu, and it is possible you got the real flu too. It's an imperfect map again, but your symptoms should be less severe than they would have been had you not had that vaccine. And it is possible that it was just an immune response and your body doing the right thing after getting a vaccine.
And that's some of the stuff that's what I think is really interesting about when you're talking about reading these studies critically. It's about looking at what happens to yourself critically as well. Let's not take these shortcuts with our language to describe what happens, because when we take those shortcuts, we lose a lot of precision and then can lead to different conclusions.
Yeah, miscommunication, broken telephone game, very common.
All the time. We're rapidly approaching the third anniversary of the identification of COVID-19 being named for the year it was identified in 2019. It's hard. It's amazing that it's 3 years now.
It still feels like Blur's Day to me.
It does. It's still March 2020, isn't it? That's like March 896 or something.
At least.
Yeah. When we went into this, we already had some maps for dealing with a pandemic. We had the SARS major pandemic, which in retrospect, well, not really in retrospect, but I mean, was 5,000 to 10,000 people died from SARS in the late aughts. And we also had the lessons we've learned from dealing with, the Ebola breakouts we've had over the past few decades, and really going back to the flu pandemic in 1918. We've had chances to learn a lot. Do you think we actually learned stuff from that and applied those lessons in the COVID era, or are we, as we head into future pandemics, are we just going to have to relearn the lessons each and every time?
I think this is a tough question. And I think the temptation here is, we can either get nostalgic and say everything was better in the old days. And it's really easy to come down on ourselves and say, oh, we handled this poorly and everything was awful. I find that, and that's true about anything that we want to look at, right? But I find that that's not really the productive way to think about it. And it doesn't lead to any change. So, I would take a look and say, what have we done well? And what could we do even better next time? So a couple of things that have gone well. The soap has run out in the bathrooms at public places, and I wonder what was happening before COVID. So that's cool. We're hand washing. Yay. Masking when you're sick is sort of becoming more acceptable. I mean, I remember that was never really a thing, but it's a polite thing to do. And so, if you know that you have a cough, maybe putting on a mask, I think that's a behavior that might become more normal now, hopefully. There's a couple of other, like the rapid pace that we saw those vaccines develop at was unheard of in 1918. And I bet they would have loved to have that, or maybe not, because it would have been considered, oh no, new and scary, right? Yeah. But I think we should stop and think about, wow, look what got accomplished. And there's a lot of controversy around it, and there's no way they did that. Well, all the factors were stacked in our favor. We had funding available instantly for this. And that was the huge driver that made this possible. A lot of trials they were looking at mRNA for a lot of conditions, but the funding was so slow, we couldn't conduct the trials fast. Then you look at incidence of the disease. Luckily or unluckily, COVID was so prevalent that these trials could move at a really, really rapid pace because we would know whether or not the vaccine was working in a short amount of time. So I think it gave us a nice template for, if you want to develop science fast, here's some factors that kind of need to be in place. And I think that's a huge lesson learned. I also think this technology, the mRNA, is going to be able to be extrapolated to other settings. We'll be able to use it for future work. And, going back to the 1918 pandemic, it's fun to kind of look back at some of the photos and see the protests that were happening then. Like, social media wasn't a thing. You had to sit for the picture, right? But there were certainly some people who were not down with masking and things then either. So it's just, I think it's so easy to get nostalgic when we weren't living there. None of us were there, I don't think, not on this podcast. But I think it's easy to sit back and everything was great then and everything sucks now. But I don't see that as necessarily the case. There's certainly some things we've gotten better at. Remote education has advanced a ton, and being able to connect via Zoom in places right now, you and I probably wouldn't be connected. Right. So there have been some good things.
Right, absolutely. And as Billy Joel has sung, the good old days weren't always so good, and tomorrow's not as bad as it seems.
That's a perfect soundtrack.
So one final question to explore. Have you started to see any studies regarding the impact of tacos on decreasing viral infections?
Yeah, tacos are for sure protective. I don't need any study to tell me that. And in fact, no study is going to prove to me that that's not true. Tacos fix everything.
And right there is the difference between science and faith.
Oh, man. Busted. In tacos, I trust.
So Remley, do you have any other thoughts you want to share with us on this subject today?
No, I think I appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation, and that, it is overwhelming. It is frustrating. And I want you to know that that's true for me as somebody who lives and breathes research for a living. So having that confidence to say, I can critically think and I can read the literature and weigh it as it comes in. That's my key takeaway.
Fantastic. So Remley, if folks want to know more about you and what you're up to, where should they go?
Twitter's a great spot to catch me at RP Crow. Also on the LinkedIn, and one of these days I'm going to get on the TikTok, but it hasn't happened yet. So stay tuned.
There we go. And you mentioned your own podcast as well.
I do a journal club. So if you want to dive into EMS research with me, you can meet with me on the second Monday of every month at noon Central. So we have the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. That is a great and very nerdy time in the EMS world.
Fantastic. And we'll have all those links over in the show notes as well. Again, Remley, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Well, thanks for having me. It has been a ton of fun.
It was great to have Remley on the show again. She originally appeared back in episode 132 last May to introduce the Ahora mnemonic to help Spanish speakers recognize a stroke. Ahora is Spanish for now, and it's the equivalent of be fast. And it's, of course, super important because whether you speak English or Spanish, with stroke, time is brain. You can learn more about Remley and the Ahora messaging at strokecast.com/Ahora. That's AHORA. And that brings us to our hack of the week. But first, let's talk about sponsor Modus Nova. To get back the use of an affected limb after stroke, you have to use it thousands and thousands of times. The Modus Hand and Modus Foot help you do just that. They are robotic, air-powered, AI-controlled exoskeletons that help you get in the thousands of reps you need for recovery, all while playing video games on the included touchscreen display. The device continues to challenge you the more you use it by making things harder or easier depending on your particular ability level. And they continue to update it all the time. To find out if Modus Nova can help you recover the use of a stroke-affected limb, visit strokecast.com/Modus Nova. Use promo code STROKECAST to save 10% off your first month. And now back to our hack of the week. Use your phone as a book weight. The other night, I was in San Francisco on a business trip, and I was having dinner at a pub, trying to read a book. I had one hand on my bread or my cheeseburger or my drink at any given time, and my other hand, in my lap because it wasn't doing a whole heck of a lot. But keeping my book open was a bit of a challenge. It kept wanting to flop closed. To ultimately keep it open, it took longer than I'd like to realize that I could just lay my phone across the open pages to keep them open as I read and ate. Obviously, this works best with heavier phones, but the key thing is that it did, in fact, work. So when you're trying to keep a book open on a table or surface, go ahead and put your phone on top of it because that may be just the weight that it needs. Plus, the edge of the phone may help you keep track of which line on the page you happen to be reading at any given time as well. So, a couple of benefits there. And speaking of books, I mentioned a couple episodes back that I had the pleasure of finally meeting author Mimi Hayes in person during a recent trip to LA. Well, last week on that trip to San Francisco that I just mentioned, I met author, urban farmer, and stroke survivor Christine Lee for lunch. Christine has been on the show a couple of times. She is the author of the book Tell Me Everything You Don't Remember, and she is as delightful in person as she is on the podcast. Be sure to check out our previous conversations at strokecast.com/Christine. To read the studies we talked about in this episode, head on over to strokecast.com/vaccine for the links. Follow Remley on Twitter at RPCrow, or just head down to strokecast.com/vaccine for her Twitter, LinkedIn, and previous Strokecast appearance links where she talked about Aora. Get your vaccine and boosters if your doctor approves. Be sure to share this episode with someone you know by giving them the link strokecast.com/vaccine. And of course, as always, don't get best. Get better. Thanks a lot. I'm Bill Monroe, and I'll talk to you soon.
The Strokecast, Bill Monroe, and Bill's guests provide general information and entertainment, not medical advice. Please do not make any changes to your treatment plan or the execution of your treatment plan without first consulting your personal doctor or medical team. The Strokecast is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.